Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Guanyu Chen. I'm from Portuguese Catholic University, and today I will talk about a special topic of indirect translation. So I'll talk about the indirect translation history in China, as well as the indirect translation studies. Since the Bible translation to the ancient Chinese Sutra Translation, indirect translation has been a frequent translational practice with a long history around the world. However, researches on indirect translation are not as long-standing as the practice itself. Even now, it's fair to say that indirect translation is still seen as a marginal area in translation studies. Reasons for its neglected status are the ignorance of difference from direct translation in the beginning of its application and its conventional image as a copy of another copy, or quoting Saint-André, a necessary evil. The first reason leads to its delayed study, while the second causes difficulties to the former and undergoing studies. For instance, the identification of indirect translations, as well as the identification of the intermediate language translation translator. What makes us feel gratifying is that as one neglected and ignored research area in translation studies, indirect translation studies have been brought back to light recently. In China, indirect translation has played a significant role in literary translation, especially during the last century. Its existence was ignored in the beginning as in the West. However, once noticed by intellectuals, evoked an influential debate in Chinese society. Nevertheless, the voices around indirect translation were quickly submerged and interrupted by subsequent political events, precisely wars and revolutions. Recent studies on indirect translation in China are scattered and random, with a great diversity of terminology. I start introducing the concept of indirect translation, and then the terminology, and in the last place, indirect translation in China. So what is indirect translation? By name, we can see the indirect translation is a translation of another translation, or from a layman's perspective, it's a translation made by mediating translated text in a process involving 3 different languages. Of course, in some cases, there are more than 3 languages involved. And in some specular cases, there are only 2 languages involved. So this is a point that I want to talk here to define or to evaluate if this case is a kind of indirect translation. Okay. So the terminology is diverse, as I said, and I will quote Sichosa, PETRA-E, and Bueno Maya. We have indirect translation, which has gained ground against other competing designations for both the process and the ultimate target text. Interestingly, this tendency runs counter to the preferences indicated in the majority of dictionaries, handbooks, and encyclopedias of translation and translation studies written in English. When referring to the process and the ultimate target text, native speakers of Iberian languages tend to opt for indirect translation, like in Portuguese, tradução indireta. The same can be said about...
Sorry, may I interrupt you? We are only seeing the first slide. Is it correct?
Sorry. Sorry, I'll share the slide again.
Okay. It's okay now. We see the...
Can you see it here?
Yes, we can now. You can go on.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, indirect translation. Okay. And when referring to the process itself, publications featuring Chinese and Japanese languages as the ultimate source or target language tend to opt for relay translation. And we have mediated translation, which is predominantly used in publications that feature foreign languages as the ultimate source or target language. When referring to the process, publications dealing with both oral and written translation tend to favor relay translation, and publications on audio-visual translation and machine translation also tend to favor pivot translation. The use of retranslation in the sense of the indirect translation appears to have been most frequent in publications dealing with Chinese as the ultimate source or target language, but this use is extremely rare now. Initially, the term second-hand translation tended to be considered as a synonym of indirect translation. Nowadays, second-hand translation is more often used as a hyponym of indirect translation, co-hyponyms being third, fourth-hand translation. Talking about indirect translation in China, I will follow this timeline from its first experience in later Han Dynasty to Opium War, and the second phase is from the Opium War to First Sino-Japanese War, and then the New Culture Movement. And the last one, I call it a new era, which is between 1949, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And here we have a 10-year of interruption of translation activities by the Grand Cultural Revolution. And I'll talk about the indirect translation in China in the four most important prosperous translation periods. The first one is Sutra Translation period, and the second is called Western Learning period, and then the New Cultural Movement and the literary translation in New Era. Sutra Translation initiated in the 2nd century, and there was a peak during 4th to 5th century, and during 7th to 8th century there was another peak. The Western learning started right after the Opium War in 1840 and ended in 1915. And the New Cultural Movement started in 1915 to 1923. So there is a historical background for the development of indirect translation in China. I think we cannot understand well the indirect translations, the development and the divulgation of indirect translation in China without getting to know the historical backgrounds. Here is the evolution of the situation in China. Firstly, China as its name, 中国, 中 means the center, so 中国 country of the center. Because all its neighbors were relatively small countries, China considered itself as the country of the center. So China had a cultural privilege for other countries, and because of this cultural privileging, there were almost no translation produced in ancient China. No or very little translation produced, because since the Chinese culture was considered as the best one. They didn't need to learn from the other cultures. But then China was beaten in various wars in the 19th century, and then the Chinese people realized that we need to learn from the Western people because we are too closed. We were too closed, and like the series of wars waked the Chinese people. And as Lin Zexu said, we have to open our eyes to see the world. So there came the need for translation. But since along the history, China had no tradition of translation, so there was a lack of translation talents. So the indirect translation appeared in that period. And until the end of the empire, indirect translation has been a prominent feature in historical records and even seen as an icon of state power. This may appear strange for you. Why indirect translation is seen as an icon of state power? So here I will quote Wang, who explained the reason. What gave the term key cultural significance, however, was a record of tribute bearers from a remote country who had to resort to relay translation to fulfill their mission to China. Since the burden of achieving communication was on the foreigners, the fact that they chose to honor the Chinese government despite such linguistic hurdles was taken as a proof of their immense respect. Hence, the greater the difficulty the foreign missions had to overcome, the greater the prestige for China. Simple statistics of the occurrence of relay translation in Chinese culture texts are a good indication of the mainstream cultural perception of the 188 entries mentioned in translation in all extant pre-Han Dynasty texts. 2/3 are about relay translation. In each case, the term is intrinsically linked to the respect shown by foreign tributary states for good governance in China. What about Sutra Translation? Sutra Translation started in very early in the 2nd century. So obviously, the Sutra translation was not accomplished by Chinese people, but by foreigners. And the indirect translation in China can be dated back to later Han Dynasty, which is from 25 to 220, when Hu, the Central Ancient Kingdom bordering West China languages, were used as intermediate language in indirect translation into Chinese. However, texts translated during this period are not the original sutra, but rather a combination of citations and interpretations. The first verifiable translated sutra only dates to the 2nd century, when monks from the Western region did the translations in cooperation with their disciples. So here, during the Sutra translation period, the intermediate language was Hu. Hu language is a combination of various different languages in the Central Asian kingdoms. And then in the West learning period, after the Opium War, as I said in the beginning, Chinese people were weakened by the Western weapons and armies, and realized the importance of learning from the West, of communicating with the West. So in the initial part of the Western learning, the translated texts were mostly about the laws, about science, and missionaries contributed a lot in this process. But I won't talk about it here because the missionaries learned Chinese and did the translations, most of the translations directly from Western language into Chinese. And here are some indirect translations. Here we have the patron Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu is a very important Chinese official, and he was the first one to employ the translation as a way of learning from the West. So he employed a lot of translators, between them Peter Parker and Yuan Dehui, who translated the Law of Nations, because after the defeat in the Opium War, Chinese Qing government had to negotiate with other countries about the payments, about the war. So Lin Zexu realized that it's important to learn the foreign laws in the negotiation. Knowing the foreign laws is very important for the negotiation with other countries. And Aesop's Fables was also translated in that period. It's not scientific, it's not about the science, it's not about laws, but it was very important in inspiring, illuminating Chinese people. And the intermediate language was English. The slogans of that period was learning the superior skills of the barbarians to control the barbarians. So the Qing government called foreigners as barbarians because of the privilege, the cultural privilege, but they decided to learn with the barbarians in order to control the barbarians. And Chinese learning for principles and Western learning for application. During the Western learning period, Chinese government or Qing government had set up various translational institutions. Between them, in 1862, the Tongwen Guan in Beijing, and 1863, Guangfan Guan in Shanghai. And the first two were translational institutions, but they have another aim, which is training the translators, translator training. And the last one, Jiangnan Arsenal in Shanghai, which was set up in 1868, was the main translational institute, which had in total 59 translators, including 8 Westerners and 1 Japanese, and about 116 texts were translated by Jiangnan Arsenal. Their intermediate languages were English and Japanese. Fictions always had a relatively low position in Chinese literature because they believed that fictions are not as important as poems, and fictions. The old Chinese fictions usually talked about love and strange stories. So Chinese people don't think fiction is don't see fiction as an important part of literature. But then Liang Qichao argued that fictions could be could be a tool to illuminate the Chinese people, could tell the Chinese people we could teach the Chinese people by telling stories in the fictions. So the translation of fictions also started, and the intermediate language was English. Translators, since Chinese after the wars, after the Western aggressions, Chinese government realized the importance of learning from the West. Chinese people also realized the importance of opening eyes. So they had a great need for knowledge, any knowledge from the Western world. But we don't have enough translational talents. So that's why many translators started to translate, even if they only know one language, one foreign language. For example, Wang, who studied in Great Britain for 1 or 2 years, and then he started to translate various foreigner authors, writers like Chen, Victor Hugo, etc. from different countries, and all source texts were English. And here is a very special figure in Chinese translation history who called Lin Shu. Lin Shu is a monolingual translator who only speak Chinese. He didn't know any foreign languages, and then he lost his wife and was very sad. And one of his friends who knew French taught him some French stories, and Lin Shu got quite interested. So he started his translation career, and his translation work was done in collaboration with other translators or other bilingual people, friends. And the working pattern was his friend explain orally the content of a book to him, and he write it down the story in beautiful Chinese language. And in this working pattern, Lin Shu came up with 245 translations, which is quite surprising. And during the New Culture movement, after the powerful weapons and strong navies of Western countries waked China up of its illusion, intellectuals realized that being isolated could be a fatal deficiency for the country. So learning from the West was considered as an effective way to save the country and its people. However, the urgent needs of translation encountered with the lack of competent translators. As a result, indirect translations became a way out during the New Culture movement. And Kang Youwei, Yang Qichao, Lu Xun were the pioneers of learning from the West movement, also called the New Culture movement, who translated Western works through Japanese because they all studied in Japan. So in the beginning of 20th century, China was invaded by translations. The number of books translated between 1,100 and 1,000, the number of books translated between 1900 and 1911 was twice that of the previous 19 years, which a majority was realized indirectly. And these intellectuals thought translation is not only the way of learning from the West, but also a way of developing the Chinese language, which, for example, according to Lu Xun, neither Chinese speech nor writing is precisely enough in its manner of expression. In other words, our language is deficient. The lack of precision in our language proves the lack of precision in our ways of thinking. We are model-headed. If we continue to use our model-headed language, even though we can read smoothly, ultimately we will find ourselves confused. To cure this ailment, I believe what we have to do is to seek to render through in wayward syntactical structures. What is old and foreign can finally be embraced as our own. And Chu Qiubai think we should adopt a new guiding principle. Chu Qiubai has rules for indirect translation since indirect translation was in need and was widely applied. So Chu Qiubai thought we should adopt a guiding principle, which is we should make sure that new words and new sentence structures become alive, and that this new means of expression can be assimilated into a living language. We should not allow ourselves to wait for the natural elimination of strong-looking expressions and sentence structures to come. This means firmly and clearly recognizing and establishing the vernacular as. And here are some translated texts during the New Cultural Movement. The intermediate languages were Japanese and English, and the Russian literature, mostly translated into Chinese via Japanese until the publication of the first direct translation in 1920. Here I have highlighted a word which is 意界. In China, when talk about translation, people prefer to use the word 意界, then 翻译. 翻译 means translation, and 意界 means translation and introduction, because the Chinese translators see translation not as a symbol, not as a simple activity, but as a way of introducing the foreign cultures. So in the new era, the intermediate languages have changed during the 1920s and 1930s. The intermediate languages were English and Japanese. And in the 1940s, it was English. In 1950s, it was Russian. All this evolution had to do with the political background of China. For instance, in the 1930s and 1940s, Chinese translators began to translate works of proletarian literature of the Soviet Union after the October Revolution, as well as the progressive literature of the oppressed and explored nations. Western literatures were also indirectly translated. And there was a grand debate on indirect translation during the 1920 and 1940. According to Cheng, such a method of two translations about is rare in no matter what country. Nonetheless, it is very important in the present literature world of our country. This phenomenon caught the attention of translators and theorists of translation who started a large-scale debate around the necessity and the limitation of indirect translation, in which the most famous writers and translators at that time was Lu Xun, Zheng Zhenduo, Liang Shiqiu, Ji Xianling, Mu Mutian. And here I have put some positions of the writers, translators, during the debate. Ji Xianling Kan Jixianling and Mu Mutian were against indirect translation. Jixianling said indirect translation was like alcohol added with water. And Mu Mutian called indirect translation the translation of buyers. But Lu Xun argued that without indirect translation, Chinese readers would not have access to Spanish, Danish, Norwegian literature, etc., due to lack of translators. And Mao Dun thought the indirect translation of War and Peace by the translator Dong Siqiu is better than the direct ones, because that indirect translation was based on Mao's translation, in Mao's English translation, and he thought this English translation was well done because Mao was a friend of the author. So Mao Dun think indirect translation doesn't have to be worse than direct translations. So I'll finish my presentation with some final remarks. Indirect translation in China was a choice of history, and the terminological issues, the terminology of indirect translation in China, even in now is quite confused. It's very diverse, so it makes it more difficult for us to identify the indirect translations, to find the indirect translation studies. And here are my references. I think I don't have much time now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting topic and introduction. We don't have much time, but maybe one or two questions if there are any. Please do not hesitate to ask or to comment. I wrote down a few questions myself. So when you were talking about the third or fourth hand translation, I can't even imagine what would it be. Does it mean that it goes through 3 or 4 languages before arriving to the target language and culture?
Yes. I think this kind of situation only occurred in special cases. For example, during the Western learning period, there were, because of the cultural privilege of Chinese government, China had no resources of foreign literatures. So every foreigner book the translator he would translate, and he wouldn't confirm the original text because it was not important. The important is the content, and the original language, the original author was not important. So maybe if this text is already indirect translation, then what he did was a forehand or fifth-hand translation.
Thank you. And what Lin Shu did, can we really talk about that as about translations? And do the Chinese theorists name it differently, or is it still translation?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Very interesting. And yes, truly, nowadays in China, the series of translation studies discuss a lot around the Lin Shu's translation. Some people think we couldn't call them translations because they are in fact rewritings or adaptations. There are lots of contents lost or changed, omissions, additions. They are not comparable to a well-done translation. But Others think the essential is the same, and in that specular historical period, Lin Shu's translation had put some new blood in Chinese in our country, and inspired a lot of Chinese writers and translators. Until today, it's hard to define translator Lin Shu because he's so special.
Thank you very much for your answers.